One of the most exciting times I had as a kid was when new video game hardware was released. For a while it was about inching ever closer to that arcade feeling at home, and then it was all about polygons and the new gameplay possibilities they presented. But really, it was all about playing games the previous generation simply wasn't capable of doing. With that in mind, I thought it would be fun to take a look at some of the games that appeared on both the Genesis and the Saturn, compare them visually, and see if there really was a generational difference. I've got 14 games that range from superscalers, to fighters, to platformers, and even a few 3D games mixed in there. Did the Saturn blow away the Genesis in every comparison, or did Sega's 16-bit powerhouse hold its own and still play great? Let's go ahead and find out. One area where the Sega Genesis struggled mightily during its lifetime was porting arcade superscalers. Most of these were choppy, lower detailed cousins of their much more impressive arcade versions. Afterburner 2 was no exception. The Saturn could do a great many things with 2D sprites the Genesis simply wasn't capable of, and you can see it here and then some. The Saturn almost flawlessly replicated the arcade right down to the speed, number of items on the screen, and the color. The Genesis needs to compromise everything. It's choppier, there's reduced sprites, and the color takes a nosedive. The Saturn of course sounds incredible as well, another area the Genesis version takes a massive hit in. This is definitely one instance where the increase in power and the CD technology helps the Saturn really make a stellar showing, leaving the Genesis game in the dust. It's a great example of how new technology can really make some sizable differences when it comes to certain types of games, and the Saturn wins this one by a mile. Castle of Illusion is one of my favorite games on the Genesis. It wasn't a hard game by any means, but it had a charm that was backed up by rock-solid gameplay and level design. When Sega brought out the Saturn version, I was expecting it to be a full-on upgrade in every way, but they instead released it as a Sega Ages product that was meant to be a one-on-one port. And the Saturn of course does it easily. Castle of Illusion was an early game in the life of the Genesis as well, so there's no crazy tricks employed similar to other Disney properties like Toy Story. Here the old Genesis just puts up some nice sprites and backgrounds that the Saturn handles easily. The gameplay is smooth and the sound is spot on for the most part. This one is definitely an oddity because most of the games the two platforms share came from arcade hardware or were ports to many different systems. This one originated on the Genesis first and foremost, and the Saturn perfectly mimics the graphics, sound, and gameplay. It kinda makes you wonder why Sega didn't reissue a lot of Genesis games on the Saturn super cheap, since most of its games sold best there. I would have picked up a Streets of Rage or Shinobi trilogy for $30 in a heartbeat. Unlike Castle of Illusion, Earthworm Gem 2 was a game that saw some design changes to improve a number of areas when it jumped to the Saturn. While the Genesis did a great job itself, the Saturn gets a bump in resolution, improved sound effects, CD music, and new backgrounds. The question here is, could the Saturn have done more? I think the developers played it really safe with this one. The sprites are mostly untouched, and I think the backgrounds could have been a lot more impressive. The fact that it was such a strong title to begin with means a next generation version should have been something really special to earn your money again. Given the fact that you must now contend with load times, I can't say this one impressed me much. The Genesis version is just as playable, and in most cases, loses nothing against the new changes outside of the improved audio. Gameplay is king, and you can't go wrong with either one. Race driving originally appeared in the arcade thanks to Atari. It was a 3D driving game released in 1989, well before mainstream polygons showed up. I'm not a fan of this game personally. I never found the gameplay to be very interesting, and the home ports just never kept my attention for very long. With that said, the Genesis version of this was a bit of a technical marvel considering the platform had no inherent polygon acceleration of any kind. It wasn't smooth, but it's always interesting to see 16-bit hardware run three-dimensional games. When the Saturn version landed in 1995, it was much less impressive however. Slow-moving racing games with single-digit polygon counts had no place in a game of that time, and race driving was a mess start to finish. Side by side, it's almost laughable that the Saturn barely does a better job than its older sibling. Oh, it runs a lot better on the Saturn, but the actual visuals are remarkably similar. If they were gonna do this for a platform of the Saturn's capability, it should have been a full-on remake with a much more impressive engine. I wasn't the only one unimpressed, as most gaming magazines at the time absolutely slaughtered the Saturn release. It received some of the lowest scores I've ever seen for the platform. Being a fan of the NFL, you can bet I was excited to see the Madden series jump to the Saturn. I had greatly enjoyed Electronic Arts' take on American football and played many of the Genesis releases for years. There are two Maddens that share the same release years between these two platforms, Madden 97 and Madden 98. When it first showed up on the Saturn, it used a mix of two-dimensional sprites and 3D polygonal stadiums. The engine worked well, looked great, and kept the same feeling we had grown accustomed to from the 16-bit games. There was more animation, the sound was much better, and you even got some commentary from time to time. Madden had not changed much over the years on the Genesis however. While the look of the sprites and the field were modified some, these games were remarkably similar in most of their design elements, so by the time we got to 1998, you had seen this game plenty of times. I had also thought that Sega was really gonna hammer Electronic Arts with a football game of their own. That never happened, and instead we got NFL 97, one of the worst 32-bit sports titles I ever had the displeasure of buying.
5, 40, good.
Mortal Kombat II was a major release on the Genesis, but by the time it hit the Saturn, everyone was already playing Part 3 on the PlayStation. Seeing these two games really illustrates the challenges that the Saturn still faced when doing two-dimensional games. It had more than enough horsepower to give you large, detailed sprites and great-looking backgrounds, but it still had its hands tied due to the rather tiny pool of memory the system had to work from. This translated to long load times, missing sound effects, and issues with characters like Shang Tsung and his morphing ability. It's pretty easy to see that visually the Saturn game is much closer to the arcade, but still is nowhere near a 100% complete arcade port. In fact, the hitching during gameplay is bad enough to impact my enjoyment, and I actually prefer the Genesis edition more. Many Neo Geo ports on the Saturn would suffer similar issues. Translating games that ran on ROM chips to a system that was restricted by CD-ROM technology and limited system memory presented a ton of challenges. I can't help but feel that the Saturn could have done this game flawlessly if it had only used one of the extended RAM cartridges. Otherwise, it's a fine example that power isn't everything when it comes to gameplay.
Fight! Fight! Well done. Get over here! Standing.
I'm willing to bet most of you have played an NBA Jam at least once in your lives. For a time, it was one of the most popular games on the market, selling millions of units in the US alone. This one is a great example of how the abilities of a new generation can really impact the quality of an arcade port. The Genesis version had been great in its own right. It played fast and smooth, and for the most part, looked close enough graphically to make everything feel just like the arcade. Of course, running it side by side to the Saturn, you quickly realize just how much better the 32-bit version actually was. Larger sprites that are animated better, more sound effects that are clearer, and just an overall better representation of the color and detail from the arcade. There's nothing wrong with the 16-bit version, but having a choice, I'll take the Saturn game every time.
Blaze it up, Fancy, move!
Robinson!
Heating up!
Having a previous look at Afterburner 2, you'd think Outrun would be a waste of time, but I don't agree. I chose this one because it's a great example of the Saturn not just bettering the Genesis version, but bettering the arcade source material that both are based on. The Genesis version was a decent enough port when it was released in 1991. The scaling is of course nowhere near as nice and the colors are a bit wrong, but for a home conversion at the time, it was well worth playing. You expected the Saturn to come along and better it, but they went quite a bit further. First, it has a great new remix soundtrack that adds all kinds of atmosphere and replayability. And then there's the smooth mode, a 60 frames per second update that makes the game run like butter. Coupling these additions together, you had one of the very best versions of this game for years, and it absolutely trounces the Genesis game in every way. It sort of set a standard for bringing older arcade games home. If you were gonna do it right, and improve it in areas that really make it stand out. It's a must-own on the Saturn and highly recommended. While not a big fan of Primal Rage myself, I felt it was a good one to cover because of the jump in quality from 16 to 32-bit. The Genesis version of this was extremely watered down. You name it and it took a massive cutback to get it running on the older hardware. The sprites are tiny, the color is dithered heavily, the backgrounds are much simpler, and the animation is severely compromised. On the other hand, the Saturn version is much closer visually. While it still sees some cuts to animation and sound effects, it resembles the arcade much more. They even added some full motion video intro and endings to the Saturn release. Digitized images were perhaps the hardest thing for the Genesis to do thanks to its limited on-screen colors, and games like this tended to suffer the most. It also didn't help that it was developed by Probe Entertainment, who rarely went above and beyond when it came to these kinds of projects. The final nail in the coffin of the 16-bit release is the fact that it plays like older revisions of the arcade game, so anyone expecting up-to-date combos and fatalities will be greatly disappointed.
Rage.
I was a big fan of Street Fighter II, so when Special Champion Edition showed up on the Genesis, I was extremely happy with how it turned out. The only real issue were the scratchy voices, but otherwise it was a great looking and playing port of the arcade. But side by side to the Saturn, you can really see just how compromised things needed to be so the Genesis could run it properly. Sprites are much smaller and see huge cuts in animation. Backgrounds do as well. One thing that is easy to notice when comparing Saturn Capcom games are the differences in resolution these games always had. The Saturn did not have a mode that could copy the arcade one-to-one, so there were always some noticeable effects on sprites and backgrounds. Often this would make things look thinner or fatter depending on how the developer treated the image. In the case of many Capcom fighting games, it often had the effect of making the fighters look larger than even their arcade counterparts. Of course, one area where the Saturn version of Champion Edition really shines is its CD audio and much improved voice samples. Super Street Fighter II: The New Challengers was also on both machines and have even more noticeable differences despite the Genesis version coming on a whopping 40 megabit cartridge. To put that into perspective, that's larger than some early Neo Geo titles.
Round one, fight!
Round one, fight!
Since we are on a fighting game kick, let's go ahead and compare Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3 as well. This is another interesting one to see side by side. While again the Saturn is much closer to the arcade, it has shortcomings of its own. The CD-ROM strikes again with load times and its effect on Shang Tsung, and there is even a missing character called Rain that was available in the Genesis. Of course, the 16-bit edition is missing loads more. Shiva is gone, sound effects are absent, and it's missing animalities and mercy. There are numerous other differences that are simply too large in number to cover, but the ones that you notice right away are the visuals. It's mainly the color that suffers in the Genesis version. In order to deal with the limited palette, extreme dithering is used, giving everything a washed out look that really impacts the digitized assets. The Saturn version suffers this to a much lesser extent and otherwise mimics the sprite size and animation quite well. Gameplay wise, they both play great. They're both fast, smooth, and had just about all the moves I could pull off from memory. This did not land at home until the summer of 1996, 8 years after the release of the Japanese Mega Drive. All things considered, you really have to respect the Genesis in this regard. It may have needed some cuts, but this was still a very playable version from much more capable hardware.
Fatality. Fatality.
When Virtua Racing popped up in 1994 for the Genesis, it was powered by the SVP, or Sega Virtua Processor. This additional math chip helped the hardware render polygons much faster than it could on its own. This resulted in a polygon engine orders of magnitude beyond what we had seen before on the Genesis. It really is something to see 1988 technology pull this off, and I can't tell you how much I wanted Sega to pursue this technology for future games on the platform. When it hit the Saturn in 1995, we got some big increases in performance, color, and polygon counts. Time Warner Interactive also added some additional features like extra tracks, vehicles, and a new Grand Prix mode. There's no question the Saturn version is the superior of the two when it comes to graphics and sound, but you know what? I am still fully impressed with the 16-bit version. I think it really showed that Sega was on the right path with the SVP chip. Had they used that as a standalone $50 upgrade and made games for it, the Genesis could have easily lasted another 2 years in the US and Europe, giving Sega much more time and experience with regards of how to handle the Saturn. The possibilities could have been truly tantalizing. Virtua Fighter, Star Wars Arcade, Doom, and many more could have benefited from this chip's addition. Hell, I still break it out every so often just to see the old workhorse in all its glory. I wanted to use World Series Baseball as a follow-up to the SVP segment to show you what a difference a 3D field could have for sports titles. You see, the Saturn version uses two-dimensional sprites for its players and 3D polygons for its stadium and field. I think this would have greatly benefited all of Sega's 16-bit sports titles at the time had Sega used the SVP. I mean, World Series Baseball on the Saturn is an absolute blast and is hands down one of the better baseball games I've played. The way the camera spans and moves across the 3D field really elevated sports titles. It also runs great, the detail is impressive, and you just gotta love the speed between switching batters and sides. You can blow through a full game in under 30 minutes typically. The Genesis version looks and plays nice itself, but the flat stadiums really age it against the much more dynamic Saturn version. I also don't like how almost all of the batter's body is off the screen in this one. Had Sega built a new line of sports titles from 1994 onward using the SVP chip, I really think it could have been a game changer. Football, soccer, basketball, baseball, boxing, you name it, and it could have been a huge boon for the brand.
It's a long fly ball deep to center. It's gone! Home run!
What'll he throw next? Is it out of here? Bond! It's a game-time home run!
I included WWF WrestleMania the arcade game because I was always impressed that this game made it to the Genesis as well as it did. Again, the Saturn version is clearly superior in color, sprite size, animation, and pretty much every other area I can think of. But seriously, take a moment and consider what you are seeing. The gameplay here is just fine on the older 16-bit hardware. Great even. You still get multiple wrestlers on screen, multiplayer options, and most of the moves are there from what I can tell. Many people lament the fact that 2D games were seen in a negative light during the 32-bit generation, but there were still plenty of them, even in the West. Polygons may have been a new thing, but games like these really showed the 16-bit hardware could still play them just fine. This lends a bit more to the evidence that Sega pulled the trigger much too early with the Saturn. With the North American and European markets doing so well for them, kicking the legs out from under your best-selling hardware may not have been the best strategy. Instead of worrying about competition for hardware they had not sold yet, concentrating on customers they already had may have been the better course of action. They would need to do something eventually, of course, but more time to strategize certainly wouldn't have hurt in the Saturn's case.
A capacity crowd here tonight. From out of nowhere. What skill? Here it comes. What a turn of events this is.
My intention here was not to take a 20+ minute crap on the Genesis versions of these games. Going in, you knew the Saturn was going to look better in every circumstance, but I wanted to show that the Genesis wasn't exactly washed up when the Saturn appeared. While the Saturn wins hands down in presentation of these titles, in many instances, the 16-bit versions played just as well. Hell, in a couple, I dare say better. This leaves all kinds of points to discuss about Sega killing the Genesis much too soon, and putting that early US Saturn launch under even more scrutiny. Sega couldn't have held out forever, of course, but I think a Genesis market using the SVP to introduce polygonal elements into tried and true Sega properties could have been a big deal. The SVP on its own likely wouldn't have been more than $50 or so, an enticingly cheap buy to get access to polygon games for those that already owned a Genesis. I think this video also showed that while the Saturn had nearly limitless two-dimensional power, that capability was somewhat stifled by the CD-ROM technology that was behind it. In order to reduce load times, developers often had their games loading things like animation and sound effects during gameplay, which in some cases had some unwanted side effects like hitching that really hampered the flow of things. Even with all that processing power, the Saturn's limited memory was a huge bottleneck that held back its full abilities. Just look at any of the Neo Geo games on the Saturn for proof. Perhaps if Sega had allowed the Genesis to go another year or so, the US and European Saturns could have shipped with the first extended RAM cartridge built directly into the unit, and that could have made a very big difference. I'm Sega Lord X. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.